All right, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for jumping onto our webinar this afternoon called Clean Trucking Rules, Opportunities to Transform Transportation in Colorado and Beyond. My name is Abby Kranz. I'm the Marketing Manager at Western Resource Advocates and your Zoom host for today. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everyone the webinar will last about 45 minutes to an hour, and most of the time will be spent just as a Q&A with our expert panelists. You should see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If at any time during the webinar you have a question you'd like our panelists to consider and answer, please feel free to chat it there. We likely won't be able to get through every single question, but they are recorded to our Zoom account, and so we'll try to follow up as best we can afterwards if we don't get to every single question during the time we have today. Other than that, we did enable closed captioning. So you should see a CC icon at the bottom of your screen as well. Feel free to enable that if you'd like to have that feature show up as our panelists discuss clean trucking rules today. And after that, I will turn this over to our transportation electrification specialist, Deborah Kopoloff. So Deborah advocates for policies with reduced emissions of transportation sector, focusing on transportation electrification, the adoption of electric vehicles in all of WRA 7 states. She works, Deborah's policy work seeks to maximize the environmental and economic benefits of transportation electrification for communities across the West. And without further ado, I'll turn that over to her, and she will be your moderator for the rest of our time.
Thanks, Abby. Hi all, thank you for being on our webinar today. And just quickly before we start our Q&A with our wonderful panelists, I'm going to go over what exactly clean trucking rules are and give a little bit of context there. So, and briefly, just a few reminders. Okay. Okay, fantastic. So clean trucking rules, a little bit of background first. The Clean Air Act has a provision which allows California to create its own rules for governing transportation emissions, which can be more stringent than the analogous federal rules. And other states can decide to independently adopt the rules promulgated by California. And the agency that is tasked with creating these rules in California is the California Air Resource Board, otherwise known as CARB. So there are three major rules related to clean trucking. The first of which is the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which is the one we will primarily be discussing today. And so that rule requires truck manufacturers to make and sell an increasing number of zero emission trucks from class 2B to 8 in states that decide to adopt that rule. And additionally, there's another component to that rule, which is a fleet reporting requirement, which requires large employers to report on their fleet operations. And we'll speak more about that later in the webinar. Additionally, there's the heavy-duty omnibus rule, which applies to traditional fossil fuel-powered vehicles and trucks. And so that requires trucks to meet stricter emissions requirements in terms of NOx. And so that leads to significant air quality improvements and has a lot of environmental impacts as well. And then lastly is the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule, which is a rule that is currently in development by the California Air Resources Board. And that rule is kind of multifaceted and has many components. But among them is a requirement for government fleets to purchase EVs for certain segments of the trucking industry, which may be easier to electrify and not as challenging as certain long haul applications to electrify earlier, and a complete phase out of fossil fueled trucks across classes 2B through 8 by 2045. And that rule is actually not yet available for adoption. CARB is still finalizing that rule. through 2022, but it will be available for states to adopt in 2023. And so now that we all have a little bit of background on these clean trucking rules, and we'll be discussing largely ACT today, I will introduce our 5 fantastic panelists. So first off, we have Sam Appel, the California State Manager at Blue Green Alliance, joining us. Sam Appel is a labor, climate, and racial justice activist and organizer based in the Bay Area by way of New York and Los Angeles. Most recently, his research and strategy helped steer United Food and commercial workers to labor and social equity policies on cannabis in Southern California and state regulatory agencies. His policy research with the UC Labor Centers and as an assembly member in 2016, laid the groundwork for the California EMS Workers' Bill of Rights. Sam holds a master's in urban and regional planning from UCLA. His capstone at UCLA, the Community Scholars Program, launched his interest in California climate justice policy, bringing together labor groups and EJ organizations to analyze policies for transforming the goods movement system. Welcome, Sam. And then next we have William Barrett, the Director of Clean Air Advocacy at the American Lung Association. Will Barrett leads the American Lung Association's work on clean air and climate change policy in California, focusing on vehicle emission standards, smart growth, and clean fuel policies. Will represents the American Lung Association before the California legislature and federal, state, regional, and local agencies engaged in clean air and climate policy. Will has served as a public health representative on advisory panels convened by the California Air Resources Board, the California Energy Commission, and other public agencies, and serves on the steering committee of Climate Plan and the board of directors for the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies. Will is a graduate of the Evergreen State College and completed the Yale School of Public Health Climate Change and Health Certification Program. Thanks for joining us today, Will. Additionally, we have Erin Kresick, the Transportation Electrification Manager at Western Resource Advocates, on with us today. As Transportation Electrification Manager, Erin leads WRA's work across the region to develop and implement policies which will accelerate the widespread adoption of electric vehicles and other technologies with the potential to significantly reduce emissions from the transportation sector. His work focuses on securing policies and plans which will maximize the environmental and economic benefits that electrified transportation can offer the Intermountain West. Erin is based in Denver, but works on transportation electrification policies across all of WRA's states. Additionally, we have Marcy Willard, the Marketing Coordinator and Grant Specialist at Lightning eMotors. Marcy Willard has worked as part of the Lightning eMotors team since November 2020. Her role includes advocacy, government relations, event planning, grant management, and business development. She is proud to be part of the industry-leading commercial vehicle company and to have the platform to be able to educate people around the value of electrification, traveling to participate in events, providing vehicle demonstrations, and doing presentations. Prior to Lightning, Marcy worked in economic development, focusing on tech transfer, public-private partnerships, and creative sector development support from robotics to artists. She has also owned her own business and served as a consultant for the state of Colorado. Great to have you on today, Marcy. And last but not least, we have Dea Zavala from Mile High Connects, where she is their executive director. As executive director, Dea Zavala leads the development and implementation of Mile High Connect's strategic direction. She is responsible for fundraising and relationship management to advance the Mile High Connect's collective priorities. Prior to joining Mile High Connects, Dea dedicated her career to supporting aspiring Black, Latinx, and immigrant entrepreneurs in Colorado and Texas as a pathway to community asset and wealth building. She also brings national experience, having worked with the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, where she facilitated a variety of community economic development projects in support of member organizations, including resource development and capacity building activities. Dea is the first in her family to graduate from high school and college, holding a Master's of Public Administration from the University of North Texas and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Texas at Arlington. Dea is a trained Technology of Participation facilitator and alumni of the NALCAB Fellowship and young nonprofit professional network Elevate Fellowship programs. She currently serves as a governor appointee to the RTD Accountability Committee, Reimagine RTD Community Advisory Group, All in Denver Board, and the Denver COVID-19 Mobility Task Force. Thank you for joining us today, Dea. And so with that, we will get started with some questions for our wonderful panelists. So to start us off, this is a question for everyone, and perhaps we can just go in the order that I introduced y'all in. So what is a specific benefit that these clean trucking rules will bring to your business or to your nonprofit's mission? And we can start off with Sam.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for having me, WRA, and great to be here with everyone. The way that Blue Green Alliance approaches our work in California, and specifically around transportation, electrification, is really from a three-pillar approach. We bring together labor unions impacted by transportation electrification. We bring together environmental advocates, and we work very closely and bring together EJ groups into the mix as well. And so when we embarked on the work plan around trucks a couple of years ago, seeing the advanced clean truck rule coming down the pipe in 2018, we brought together a table of stakeholders from each of our three constituencies that we work most closely with. And we identified a very significant overlap for all of our key partners in these rules, because the transition to electric trucks is both at the same time an opportunity to reduce toxic pollution in communities of color impacted by goods movement across California, and particularly in port-side communities, while also reducing greenhouse gases and potentially creating an opportunity to transition what is currently one of the worst employment industries in the United States into a potentially better, more fair industry. The trucking industry is, one of the worst industries to work in the United States. So, this suite of rules has really been an opportunity to really find deep alignment between labor, environmental justice allies that BGA organizes. So it's really been a great opportunity to work on these rules. I'll talk more about that later.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. And Will, I will pass it to you.
Sure, and thanks again for having the Lung Association as part of this conversation today. The Advanced Clean Trucks rule is just a critical tool for public health. As a public health organization, our mission is really to save lives by improving lung health and preventing lung disease. And we know that the trucking sector is a dominant source of unhealthy air or harmful air pollution. And we know, as Sam said, that the burdens of unhealthy air fall disproportionately to many communities, especially communities of color and lower income communities who are just disadvantaged due to heavier doses of carcinogenic diesel pollution, heavy doses of fine particle emissions, and ozone for that matter. So we know that this sector is a leading contributor to air quality challenges in Colorado, but also all across the United States. And we know that as more and more states take action on the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, moving to zero emission trucks, it really is going to cut the pollution that is threatening health and costing lives in communities across the United States. So that's just a start.
Great, thank you. And Aaron, we'll move to you.
Yeah, thank you. I see a lot of benefits that can come with these rules, but I like the two people who spoke before me. I think it's the air quality benefit that excites me the most for the particularly for the advanced clean truck and the heavy duty omnibus rules. Medium and heavy duty trucks make up a small total of the number of vehicles on the road, but a huge proportion of the total emissions. So those vehicles have an outsized impact when you compare it to your personal vehicle that you're driving around, particularly in terms of air quality. And there was a recent report done by the Colorado Energy Office that showed that, the heavy duty omnibus and advanced clean truck rules paired together can, provide some pretty tremendous improvements to our air quality, which has, suffered greatly in recent years, and has a lot of impacts on everyone's quality of life. And as Will mentioned, particularly those communities of color that have been the most impacted by poor air quality. There's a lot of great climate benefits too. So there's certainly a lot to be excited about, but yeah, I would say the air quality part is the most exciting for me.
Absolutely. And then we'll move to Marcy and then Daya.
You bet. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. For those of you who may not be familiar with Lightning eMotors, we are a commercial battery electric vehicle manufacturer based in Loveland, Colorado. And we build class 3 to class 7 vehicles, trucks, shuttles, vans, school buses, charging infrastructure. So that's the segment we come from. Our mission at Lightning is to continue to be the industry leader in this segment, growing revenue, growing jobs, and helping to grow local, regional, and statewide economies. And then through the deployment of our vehicles, really help offset climate change. It's very important for us to be part of this ecosystem, improve air quality, and address public health issues. So it's twofold for us. It comes from growing the company. It also comes from doing the right thing, again, for climate, air quality, and public health. So we see this ACT rule as really helping us not only support, but accelerate our mission and helping us reach these goals and objectives.
That's really great. Thanks, Marcy.
So yeah, for Mile High Connects, we're a little bit of a unique organization to engage in this conversation. Mile High Connects is a regional collaborative in the Denver metro area that's really focused on achieving a racially equitable and resilient 7-county district in the Denver metro area. So the way that we typically work is to bring together our community advocates alongside philanthropic partners and other key decision makers to really bring community-driven solutions to life. We're really interested in this conversation, recognizing the intersections of these rules alongside issues that we believe in around affordable housing, economic opportunities, and mobility, and then acknowledging that these rules will ultimately reduce the health inequities that have been disproportionately borne by residents of color in our communities and in our region. So we're really hoping to look at this from a couple of different perspectives, hopefully achieving better health outcomes, but also ideally better economic outcomes as our communities start to reap the benefits of this longer term.
Great, thanks, Daya. And so now we'll move into talking about the advanced clean truck rule a little bit more specifically. So the rule affects different parts of the trucking industry, from truck manufacturers, fleet owners, as well as truckers themselves. So Marcy, could you speak a little more to the effect that this rule will have on truck manufacturers? And then Sam, I would love if you could speak a bit about how fleet owners and truckers themselves will be impacted.
You bet. So we feel that this ACT rule really compels legacy OEMs to phase out their ICE vehicle production. What this does is open up the markets for smaller manufacturers like Lightning, and then allows us to scale to meet this market demand. Between the phasing as well as the reporting, it creates a landscape in which we can identify the gaps in the market that are being created. We can forecast, plan for growth, hire accordingly, and it also helps to expand our R&D programs. So this phase transition really helps smaller OEMs plan to meet these demands and doesn't put us in a panic at the end. Let's say at a 2040, all of a sudden we have to do this, and now there's supply constraints and resource issues and things. It also then encourages fleets to transition, and again helps us identify the needs and how we can work with them closely. And just basic economics, the more we sell and the more we produce, the more the prices come down, and of course that's a concern for fleets.
On the labor side, we're seeing interest from 3 different segments of labor, essentially, in these rules. One, the drivers of trucks, most often represented by the Teamsters, the folks that install charging infrastructure, often electrical workers, and then to a lesser extent, but still relevant, manufacturing unions who build trucks in the US. Particularly on the driver side, there is an opportunity with the suite of rules, which ACT kind of lays the first foundation for, to study the incidence of what is probably the single most significant structural problem in the trucking industry, which is misclassification of truck drivers as independent contractors. And in the ACT rule, through the reporting requirement, and then through the suite of rules, begin to assign responsibility financially in the transition to electric fleets to the corporate parents of the companies that actually do the trucking work. In other words, in rules past, the financial responsibility for transition has fallen onto drivers because they've been misclassified as independent contractors, and the opportunity before us with the transition ahead is to make sure that the costs of electrification are internalized by the companies that are truly the beneficiaries of the economic activity in this industry. So the job impacts could be really significant, especially in short haul trucking, where independent contractors in the trucking industry routinely make, on average, somewhere between $27,000 and $35,000 a year before the financial costs of operating the truck in the business that they do under the misclassification scheme. So, some of our allies in the labor movement who work with these drivers have shown that drivers in short haul trucking routinely come home with negative paychecks. So that's the sort of opportunity before us with these rules, is to, in some ways, look to change this industry and the business and some of the painful business models that have been structured in through previous rules to decarbonize trucks.
Thank you, Sam, for that really helpful information about the labor tie-ins here. And to just further understand the scope and potential impact of the adoption of these rules, Aaron, would you mind letting us know if there are other states that are considering implementing clean trucking rules in the near future?
Yeah, certainly. So, as was covered, I think, in the introductory slide, there's two relevant rules here. The Advanced Clean Truck Rule and the Heavy-Duty Omnibus Rule. Advanced Clean Fleet Rule is not yet available for other states to adopt. So California promulgated those rules in 2020. So 2021 was really the first year that states had a shot at those rules. And so far, we've seen 3 West Coast states, Oregon, California, and Washington, adopt the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. And California and Oregon took the Heavy-Duty Omnibus Rule. And it also looks like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and maybe Maine will also join the Advanced Clean Truck states by the end of the year. And then in 2022, we're hoping that the ranks are going to swell even further with a number of Eastern Seaboard states considering the rule. Hopefully in the Intermountain West region, Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico will be having rulemakings and considering adoption of these rules. So it's a sort of a flutter of activity at the state level. And I think for a lot of environmental transportation focused groups, this is one of the key focuses that is being honed in on across the US at the state level.
That's great to hear. Very exciting time for clean trucking rules. So Will, I want to come back to you so we can talk a little bit more about the benefits that can be reaped through these rules. So would you be able to tell us all about the benefits ACT can bring to communities impacted by pollution from trucks?
Sure, happy to. And I think, ultimately, again, that's the Lung Association's primary interest in this rule, is eliminating pollution from trucks. We know, for example, that when we put out our annual State of the Air report every April that kind of ranks communities across the US based on air pollution, and Denver unfortunately shows up in the top 10 most polluted by ozone or summertime smog. And we know that the trucking sector is a major source of NOx emissions that form into ozone and particle pollution. So we know that there are major benefits that are needed in terms of reducing ozone forming pollution from the trucking sector. And we know that by doing that, we will be able to target reductions in asthma attacks, heart attacks, strokes, and lung cancer. I mean, these are major health emergencies we're talking about that are generated in part by trucking emissions, and really at the core of why these types of rules, both the ACT and the low NOx rule, are so important. I think it's really important also to know just the communities as a whole can benefit, but those communities, sub-communities that are most deeply impacted by transportation pollution really have a tremendous amount of health benefit to gain based on just the inequities of where pollution lands and who's breathing it more. By eliminating pollution from the tailpipe, eliminating tailpipes altogether, we're promoting public health, promoting lung health, and in reality saving lives because people are breathing healthier air. I think it's also important to note just briefly that combustion engines, fossil fueled engines, when they're combusting, they're certified to certain levels, but we know that oftentimes they're emitting far above what they're supposed to be. So that's always on our mind too, is we know that we need to clean up engines. We know we need to make sure that those engines that are burning fuel are operating like they're supposed to, but there are still things that go wrong, things that break down. And the shift to zero emission is sort of providing certainty that the air will be cleaner as that truck goes by, as it's supposed to be, so that everyone can breathe clean and healthy air.
Thanks, William, for that. Erin,
there's one thing I could share. Sorry,
yes,
I just wanted to share a statistic that I think really ties in to what William's saying, and that's when I've dealt with grants, I look up for data and statistics, and when you take one bus or an equivalent GVWR vehicle, so a big vehicle, where you take one bus, it's the equivalent of 170 cars. So this is really significant what we're talking about when we switch these over to zero emission and encourage fleets and OEMs to look at things differently. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy, for that fantastic statistic. That's really illuminating.
And I think just, if I could just add one quick
absolutely.
thing, Marcy, that's great. Erin mentioned something earlier that I'd just like to kind of note too, is that, so I'm in California. We just went through some big trucking rules in California, and here it's about 3% of the vehicles on the road are heavy duty trucks, and they produce over half of the pollution on the road. So it really is just this scale issue of, there's not that many trucks, but they put out a tremendous amount of harmful pollution, carcinogenic pollution. And that's what we really need to get a handle on. And that's why the ACT rule and the low NOx rule are just so critical. So thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Trucks have an outsized effect on pollution and air quality impacts. Erin, I'm gonna double back to you for a question on the actual implementation of this rule. So there is some flexibility in how states can implement these rules from the California Air Resources Board. Can you expand on that a little bit and talk about how that might play out in different states?
Yeah, definitely. So, while California has this unique rulemaking ability under the Clean Air Act, and they're the only state that is able to make their own rules, states do have some discretion to determine, which parts of the rule they want to adopt, as well as compliance with those rules. For example, a state could adopt the advanced clean truck rule, but not the heavy duty omnibus rule, as Washington has done. They could adopt the advanced clean truck rule, but not the fleet reporting requirement, which I believe Washington has also done. As an environmental advocate, we would certainly advocate for them to adopt, both of those things, fleet reporting requirement and the heavy duty omnibus rule, to, curb dangerous NOx emissions and to improve labor conditions. But, that being said, states do have the discretion to forego adopting certain components or certain rules, certain components of the rules. And then there's also ways that states can ease the stringency or the compliance. There's different ways states can comply with the requirements with different crediting mechanisms. And again, we would advocate for states to adopt rules which most rapidly transition us to electrified models to capture the public health and environmental and economic benefits. But states do have some discretion in how they meet the stringency requirements of the rules, which is part of the reason why it's really important for folks to get involved at the state level in their advocacy to make sure these rules are designed in a way that promotes the most benefit.
Yeah, that's a great thought. And speaking of the adoption process and getting the folks most impacted involved, what is there that can be done to ensure that frontline and underrepresented community voices are elevated and heard as Colorado and other states consider implementing clean truck rules? And Dea, would you like to speak to this?
Sure. I mean, I think for us, whenever we talk about frontline communities and underrepresented, we always center ourselves on how is equity ultimately reflected in the rulemaking and the decision making. And so what does that mean? It's really being specific and having measurable outcomes in how disproportionately impacted communities are really centered and part of the ultimate decision making. I think for us, a couple of things that are really important. As I said, Mile High Connects is new to this conversation. And so we always come at it from a place of ensuring that we are breaking down these terms into really practical, everyday kind of conversation, right? How do we make it more approachable for every community to engage and really understand what we're talking about? Oftentimes, when I enter these spaces, and I say this as an individual with a lot of privilege, we speak of it in terms of either hypotheticals or very academic terms, but I think at the end of the day, we need to really talk about it in practical terms and how this impacts everyday individuals. What's the ultimate result that we're hoping to achieve? I think the second, and this is something that we really strive for as an intersectional organization, is reaching out to those not so usual suspects, right? Folks like myself, Mile High Connects, and other entities, reaching out to the microbusiness community, microbusiness lenders, labor, which was mentioned earlier. So getting more diverse perspectives into the conversation, because ultimately the impact of this will have ripple effects across multiple different industries and communities. I think the last thing, and this is really just centering underrepresented communities, is that as we go into rulemaking, as additional community meetings are being held, really just honoring the time and the expertise of our communities. And the way that we need to do that is really by stipending communities to participate in these kinds of processes. I am very lucky, many of us are very lucky in that we're representing our community organizations' hats. But for a resident that's engaging in this conversation, they're taking time away from family, from work, from other obligations to participate and actively engage. And so I think we need to be really mindful about how we are authentically engaging community in the conversations and compensating them for their time, talent, and treasure in contributing to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dea, for making those points about how there are certain barriers to participation for those folks who are most impacted by these rules and by truck pollution. That's a really great thing to keep in mind as we move into the rulemaking processes. So speaking of the ripple, yeah, Sam, go ahead.
I just wanted to throw one more idea out there, which was, I think one thing that's been really interesting and the kind of a very positive development in the advocacy community in California over the last over the cycle of these truck rules is that the advocacy community has also integrated labor and environmental justice voices into the core decision-making structure of the coalitions that are coming together to advocate for these rules. So from a process perspective, I think we're doing better as environmentalists and as labor advocates than we've done in the past to really kind of be working together at the core of the kind of visioning process and kind of a goal identification process during these campaigns. And I hope we can continue that.
That's great. And Sam, I actually just had a question for you, speaking of the ripple effects that this rule will have. So thinking about those who work in the auto industry, how will ACT affect workers in the auto supply chain and final assembly sectors?
Totally. Well, the truck manufacturing industry and the supply chain for it is largely a domestic set of industries, domestic set of suppliers, domestic set of assemblers, and many of them, a large majority, are unionized, represented employers And that's for the legacy OEMs for the most part. And those represent a very significant supply of high quality jobs across the United States, but really clustered in the Midwest and in the manufacturing states. And we know how critical those jobs are from, as our economy is polarizing, we're seeing incredible economic inequality. The importance of those jobs just becomes ever greater, not just for the people who have them, but for the health of our political climate that we're in, and that seems to be sort of deteriorating as the years go by. But at any rate, the opportunity with the rules that we're discussing today is essentially one in which we can incentivize and regulate and create standards for an ongoing, healthy, robust ecosystem of manufacturers in the US that are unionized, or we can, kind of let the market run its course, and we could see massive offshoring of these jobs and the supply chain for them. And the opportunity of the former is really big. I mean, there's an opportunity to create the supply chains for batteries, for advanced manufacturing components, to make sure that we're supporting high road businesses like some of the folks on the call, and helping to ensure that companies that are treating their workers well are benefiting in the transition. So there's quite a bit of opportunity there, but we know that mergers and acquisitions are just skyrocketing in the auto space. There's immense pressure from the market and from investors to offshore supply chains and to build these vehicles in poor regions of the world, where essentially you can build stuff and dump all the waste into the river next door and pay people close to nothing. And we know that's the race to the bottom that we're fighting against. So these rules, it's very hard to structure economic equity into them directly for the manufacturing component. But that's why it's ever so important that complementary rules to these, such as those on climate investments and some of the things that are being considered in the federal reconciliation package around union made, are so essential to making sure that this policy is beneficial to the folks in the manufacturing supply chain.
Thanks for that, Sam. And we're really happy to have Marcy on representing the manufacturing sector. So Marcy, could you tell us a little bit more about how this rule would affect y'all at Lightning eMotors, including how this would affect the development of additional clean truck models, and the number of trucks available for purchase in ACT implementing states?
Sure, and just really quickly to add on to what Sam was saying, for instance, Lightning's a Buy America company. That requires 75% or more of the parts and pieces that go into our vehicles to be made in the US. And we do full assembly here as well. So that requires us to use supply chain within the US, but we also try very hard to use supply chain within Colorado. So as we grow jobs and revenues, so does our supply chain. And so to just give you a quick example, a year ago, I was employee number 75. We have over 200 now. And we're hearing those exact same percentages scaled up or down with our supply chain. So as we grow, they are as well. So just to weigh into that. What we will be seeing as a rule like this would phase in is, again, an ability for us to identify the gaps, what's going to be needed on the market, and again, to scale for those jobs, scale with our supply chain, and hire. And one of the things we do as well as far as labor goes is we retrain. Again, we're adding new jobs, but we're retraining, and we're also doing internships. And so I think that's important to note as well. And so as we identify these gaps, we may find that a certain chassis that lends itself well to dump trucks is really becoming an issue. Then maybe we put our R&D around those efforts, or maybe we look at some things that are harder to produce than others that an OEM might target first, right? Because they'd have smaller sales for a big OEM, but for a smaller OEM, we might be willing to take that that on. So I think there's really wonderful opportunities for our R&D to align with the gaps that start to be identified with this and to really scale.
That's really exciting to hear. Thank you for sharing that, Marcy. So just going back a little bit to the more downstream impacts of this rule, communities that are burdened and disproportionately burdened by diesel truck emissions have a lot of challenges around organizing to participate in this rule. And I think, Day, you spoke to this a little bit already, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to expand on your previous answer.
Sure. I mean, I think we all on this call acknowledge that, many of these areas that have high concentration of polluting vehicles are really the product of systemic racism in policies and planning decisions, community planning, zoning, starting all the way back with redlining as a way of like purposefully routing highways through Black and brown communities to basically create these pockets of health inequities. I mean, we know, and William hit on this earlier, so many of these communities have what's essentially generational diseases that are caused as a result of poor air quality, from asthma to respiratory illness, heart disease, cancer, you name it. I mean, what we're really talking about is health inequities. So, I mean, when I think about community organizing and really bringing communities to this conversation, I think we really need to just acknowledge that these disparities often lead to communities' inability to participate. It's not necessarily that they don't want to engage in the conversation, but when I'm trying to just take care of my own health, it can be challenging. So I think we need to really honor communities and just ensuring that whenever we're having these conversations, people are bringing their unique stories to this conversation and their unique experiences and honoring their life experience as expertise in this dialogue. And that really this experience that they live every single day should be the guiding force of why we need these better rules in our communities, and really just honoring the expertise that they bring to the conversation. I think the other thing that I just want to lift up, and I think everyone acknowledges this, is that COVID has really shown a light on how we breathe. COVID and climate has really shown a light on that. So it's important for us to continue centering that and just acknowledging that COVID may be a point in time, but these are going to be issues that we work on through, for generations to come. And so really by taking this one step, starts to put us in the right direction of addressing root causes of health inequities in several of our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the health inequities, William, have there been any quantifications of the public health benefits of adopting these rules? And can you speak a bit more about the scale of benefits from adoption of these rules?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that intuitively we know that eliminating tailpipe emissions is a positive for public health. We know that diesel exhaust is a carcinogen, causes cancer. Particle pollution just does a terrible amount of damage to our bodies. It, can get deep into our lungs, cause all sorts of respiratory problems, but also cross into the bloodstream, causing heart attacks and strokes and premature death. We know also that I mentioned ozone before, so we know that the trucking sector is a major source. So again, intuitively, if we're eliminating emissions from the tailpipe, eliminating tailpipes altogether, that's a net positive for public health. And one of the things that the Lung Association did in 2020 was a national study on zero emission transportation. And what we found in that study, which we envisioned, the wide scale transition for passenger vehicles all the way up through heavy duty vehicles, sort of based in part on the work that California was doing at the time on the ACT rule in that study. And we found that nationally, we could see 72 billion in annual public health benefits, thousands of lives saved, tens of thousands of asthma attacks avoided, and hundreds of thousands of lost work days avoided because the air would be cleaner. In Colorado, when we look at that state as its own in that study, we're nearly $700 million in annual public health benefits. That's, in terms of lives saved, asthma attacks avoided, people not missing work because they're too sick to go to work because of poor air quality issues. So we know that there are major public health benefits on the table. when we're talking about going to zero emission transportation, and in particular trucks, because they do have such that outsized impact on air quality and lung health. So major benefits to be had by moving these forward.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the real life impacts that adopting this rule will have. That's really exciting to hear. So talking a little bit more about other policies that can go in hand with this rule, are there any complementary policies with the implementation of ACT that can lead to increased emissions reductions and public health benefits?
Yeah, I can take a shot at that one. I think, when we're talking about kind of building off of what William said, making this transition to having no tailpipe electrification of the medium and heavy duty sector. The advanced clean truck rule is a manufacturer requirement that's absolutely critical to increasing the amount of electric vehicles and low NOx vehicles, to a lesser extent, trucks that are available. We need that in order to have more on the roads. But that alone isn't going to be enough. There's still other barriers to electric trucks in the form of upfront costs and charging infrastructure availability. Right now, an electric medium heavy duty truck is significantly more expensive than a internal combustion engine fossil fuel powered car. We expect that trend to, we expect that to change over time as the cost of batteries continues to decline, and eventually expect that these costs will be similar. But for now, they do have a higher upfront cost, even though there's lifetime savings in terms of fuel and maintenance. It's less expensive for an electric car. But the upfront cost can be daunting. Luckily, there's help on the way. There's coming from the federal government in terms of if the Build Back Better bill passes, there's going to be support for incentives to purchase medium and heavy duty trucks. In Colorado, we're fortunate enough to have the green enterprises, which, although they haven't been fully developed, they will also provide incentives, ideally, to purchase medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. And then on the charging infrastructure side, also critical. You could have as many vehicles if you want, but if you don't have a place to charge them, it's not going to work very well, and it's going to take time to build that network. But we also have things that we can lean on. The bipartisan infrastructure bill provides quite a bit of funding for electric vehicle charging. That's something that all the states in the country are going to be able to leverage. In Colorado, again, the green enterprise funds are going to provide significant funding and planning around where we need medium and heavy duty electric vehicle charging. And then one last thing on the charging side of things, something that, WRA has been really involved in and has been a real positive for electric vehicle charging has been utility transportation electrification plans. That's been where we've seen a lot of movement in the last year and a half. And while, with plans like Xcel Energies in Colorado, NV Energy in Nevada, Public Service Company of New Mexico, some of these big utilities really making significant investments to build out the charging infrastructure. And while that has mostly focused on the light duty side, I would expect that as medium and heavy duty trucks become more mainstream, they'll be trying to help build out the charging infrastructure for those vehicles as well. So we certainly have plenty of work to do, but it's encouraging to me to see all these complementary policies starting to come together and build an ecosystem where electric trucks can thrive.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for kind of explaining the various pieces that will be a part of this puzzle of electrifying the medium and heavy duty sector. So I have a two-parter question for Sam. So first, could you briefly explain the fleet reporting requirement of the ACT? And then secondly, does the advanced clean truck rule necessitate any other vehicle features, such as autonomous vehicles?
So to answer the second one first, no. No autonomy required or sort of incentivized necessarily. And then to the first, the reporting requirement in the ACT rule gathers data from fleets. So essentially, the ACT rule is the rule that impacts manufacturers directly. But the reporting requirement essentially provides a data gathering piece to inform the fleet rule. Were Colorado to continue down the road of the trucking CARB's trucking regulations, it's a 177 state, that data would become essential to understanding the industry, understanding the market impacts, forecasting, doing charging infrastructure planning and things of that sort. The key piece from a truck driving labor side is that in that reporting requirement in California, what we've done is we've created a definition of the company that controls the trucking operation, and in so doing, ask those companies to provide data on the number of trucks that they operate and in the state, and provide data on those trucks. So essentially, we have a source of data, and there's a certain threshold cutoff for the size of firm that has to report. So I believe it's 50 or more trucks, which is to reduce the burden on smaller fleets. But essentially what this does is it gives CARB and would give potentially the Colorado regulators a data set which previously has not really existed, to understand the size, scale, and nature of contract trucking operations in the state. And that would in theory, hopefully, fingers crossed, enable the regulatory agencies to really take a proactive role in making sure the financial responsibilities for these rules falls on the corporate parents in the industry.
That's great to hear. So we are unfortunately running low on time. So to wrap up, we're just going to do a quick lightning round question for all the panelists. What are some challenges to implementing this rule? And then also lessons to take away from California or from other places that have gone through or are going through this rulemaking process?
I'll jump in and start with a quick, challenge and opportunity, really. And I think part of it is really a communications issue, really making sure that the public understands just how significant the share of pollution that we're dealing with is coming from the trucking sector, and that the importance of rules to control that pollution in the real world, creating real world benefits to their health through these types of rules is really important. And I think one key takeaway is that the more that we've seen in Oregon, Washington, as well as California, that these numbers are put forward to people to really bring the case home that we have a significant air pollution challenge. The trucks are a major source of that challenge. There are huge disparities in who's being most impacted and burdened by the pollution. And this is a solution that's on the table and growing in multiple states, really building out a broader market that everyone can take advantage of. It's just a matter of the political will to get it over the finish line.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, I can't say that I've gone through this rulemaking process before, but from kind of the conversations that I've been in with the state level advocates that have, and talking to allies like Sam from other states, it seems to me that building a coalition of diverse stakeholders with a wide range of interests is really important to underscoring to our state regulators and state government that there's a widespread support for these rules. Pulling together groups of environmental advocates, environmental justice organizations, labor groups, private industry, public health, local governments, all of those voices I think are really important to show that there's widespread support for this, and kind of push back on any negative pushback that we might get for implementing this rule.
Some of what we're hearing as I've sat in on some of the webinars from California and the other states is just the reporting requirements are difficult. It's hard to define who's going to do it, kind of like Sam mentioned, and how's it, how are we really going to get the data that's needed? And so I think it's really important to set up the reporting so that we absolutely get the data that we need that's most impactful, but to do it in a way where it's a bit navigable, because we've already got enough barriers to entry in this industry as it is, and we just can't make it harder and harder for people to comply. Even if they want to do it, we can't make it harder and harder for it to happen. So I think we need to really work on the reporting so that we get the data that we need, but that it's also doable. And if anything, perhaps encourages fleets to really take a look at what they're doing and how they can mitigate some of that. And then I will also say that, as we've seen in other states, we have to have the incentives to align with these rules. Certainly they can sunset out, but to encourage this early adoption and this help transitioning fleets, we absolutely have to have incentives, and not only for vehicle purchase and infrastructure, which are terribly important, but transition planning. So for instance, the money that's rolling out from the federal government will require a transition plan or sustainability plan in place. And so we need to make sure we're funding that as well, so that we can set these fleets up to be successful.
Yeah, I would just drive home both William and Erin's points. I mean, I think especially around communications and community, I think it's incredibly important that we not only share this information widely, but also ensure that the information is being translated into a diverse set of languages so that all community residents are able to participate in this process. And then around the diverse coalitions, again, I can't stress enough the importance of bringing together unique sets of folks that don't traditionally work in the same spaces, to really understand that this impact will be felt across a variety of different stakeholders, but just ensuring that we bring together the folks that Erin mentioned alongside affordable housing folks, because again, the ripple effects of this will be felt in very unique ways. And it will only help us in the front end to have diverse voices at the same table.
And, I think I'll come back to maybe the first thing I said, which is that this set of rules just represents such a unique opportunity to bring together labor, environmental, and EJ partners. The fates of the communities that are impacted by the pollution, the fates of the workers who live in those communities and are driving the trucks for, starvation wages. And then, the environmental goals that hinge upon this. There's such a deep synergy among our groups. And then, of course, with the folks who stand to benefit from installing and building infrastructure and the vehicles themselves. So we've really seen an unprecedented alliance across on this rule in California. And then it's really necessary to think about the rule holistically. How does it connect to our incentive mechanisms? Making sure the money's there, but making sure the money's going to the right actors, building a high road economy. And so I would, encourage you to think big and think broadly.
Great. Thanks so much to all our panelists today for taking the time to share your expertise and knowledge on these clean trucking rules. And unfortunately, we are out of time, so I will turn it back over to Abby Carranz to talk about supporting the clean trucking rules in Colorado.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks to all of our panelists, and thanks everyone who was able to jump on and attend today. Just a few reminders: if we didn't get to your questions in the Q&A chat box, we will do our best to follow up afterwards. And then just a reminder that we will be sending out an email to anyone who attended or registered through WRA's registration page, an email with the recording and any resources that we sort of talked about today. And last but not least, like was mentioned in the conversation, Colorado Air Quality Control Commission will be considering the adoption of the Advanced Clean Truck Rule in Colorado for 2022, or early in 2022 is when they kick off that process. So feel free to jump on our website, add your name to our growing list of supporters who support adopting that rule in Colorado. And if you do that, we'll be sure to keep you up to date with any new developments as we try to get the Advanced Clean Truck Rule passed in this state, as well as other states across WRA's region. So thank you so much again for attending. And thanks once more to all of our panelists. Bye all.